Hello and welcome to another episode of Spart Talk. Today we're bringing you a slightly different episode. The Sparts are in conference mode. Our different sections are therefore having national gatherings to discuss the state of their respective countries and the dynamics of politics therein. So I thought it would be good to give our listeners a sense of what that's like by presenting to you a report by Comrade Jesse from Johannesburg in South Africa, where things are looking less and less rosy for the ANC, the party of Mandela, the party which has governed the country in a coalition with other forces since 1994. This party faces growing difficulties as South Africa begins to feel the crunch of international events and the breakdown of the liberal world order. As Jesse will argue, the crisis of the ANC is a boon to the right, with forces like the MK, the party of former President Jacob Zuma, and even March and March, the group behind the large anti-immigrant protests which rocked the country on the 30th of June. So, to make sense of the rightward shift in South Africa, here is Jesse. Enjoy.
Comrades. So, I want to start with, I think there's a number of pretty significant political developments that in different ways point to a more substantial shift in the political situation in the country. So first is the anti-immigrant marches, which as we talked about, although they haven't been as bloody as the pogroms in 2008 or subsequent waves, what really makes this a qualitative change is just how the sustained and mass character of the campaign that March and March has been waging. Second important thing is obviously the sentencing of Malema, which on the one hand represents a really further shift towards the government kowtowing to the U.S., political repression. And we should remember, going back a few months, this was followed literally just a few days after by March and March really accelerating kicking their attacks into high gear. And now we also have Kalani's case back in the courts. The impeachment drama around the Phala scandal, I think, is another thing, which is obviously nowhere near Ramaphosa's greatest crime, hiding cash in his sofa. But what is significant, I think, about it is that you see since the Constitutional Court ruling, it highlights very starkly the impasse for the ruling class if he goes. Because Ramaphosa embodies the hopes of, in some way, in a modified form, kind of continuing the post-1994 system a bit longer. Fourth, we have the local elections coming up in November, which obviously are linked to the March and March campaign is closely linked to that, and we're going to see that. And there's going to be, I think pretty clearly, further collapse of the ANC's electoral support. But in addition to that, there's sort of questions raised by it in terms of the left, which is what is going to happen with the SACP's bid for independent candidacy? What does that mean about the tripartite alliance? What's going to happen with the EFF, especially if they suffer setbacks? And in the background to all of those things going on and sort of constantly, it's on in the news all the time, are the inquiries into in Parliament and the judicial inquiries into the infiltration of state agencies by these criminal syndicates, highlighted by assassination of a number of witnesses, including attempted assassinations of heads of the police, and different arms of the state agencies tried to arrest the heads of other arms. So what I think that really signifies is growing levels of disgruntlement, including within the command of the armed bodies of men, which have been really hollowed out by decades of austerity and looting and become quite factionalized. And this is, I don't think Bonapartism is around the corner, but this really shows kind of the reserve potential of Bonapartism. And I'm quite confident that the ruling class must be putting out its probes and feelers as to who are the people among these different things that we could potentially work with. So my aim is not to kind of go into a long in-depth on each one of these things. It's more to try to put all these disparate things into a context of the main trends of development that we're seeing and we have been seeing for a few years. Look at how some of our ways of looking at this previously have held up, what's sort of different, our projections in particular, and kind of get a better understanding again of where is the working class and the left and how do we fit into these things. So to start with, we already made the point 2 years ago after the GNU was formed that the post-1994 model has really run its course. In the editorial of ABA number 2, I'll just quote from it, we said, up until now, the ANC was able to support itself politically on the votes of the Black majority, using this to carry out a neo-apartheid policy centered on defending the assets and dominance of white monopoly capital. This was made possible by the ANC being able to tell the masses that there's no alternative to the Washington Consensus on the one hand, and on the other hand, there was relative stability and marginal economic growth that allowed them to shake some crumbs and alleviate some of the worst poverty of the masses. But we made the point at the time, 2024, that over the past decade and a half, this has become increasingly untenable. And the general trend is it has become further, more and more untenable. South Africa is being squeezed, in particular by U.S. imperialism and the breakdown of the liberal order. We noted that the Ramaphosa clique's choice to enlist the direct support of openly pro-imperialist white parties is going to keep them, make it possible for them to hang on in the short term and preserve their positions. But the longer term, it's only going to further accelerate the ANC's collapse. I believe, and I don't think this is like going out much on a limb, that we are going to see this confirmed with the November local election results. I think that, in fact, about the November elections, I would say that's kind of the one safe bet if you're looking for predictions. But I want to make the point at the same time, we need to recognize that the GNU itself has proved much more stable than what we projected 2 years ago. We said it will not be smooth sailing for white monopoly capital and its Black agents. Pressure from global financial markets combined with neoliberal attacks is a recipe for shocks and social unrest. These pressures promise to further fracture the Black elites, eroding the ANC's ability to contain discontent. So I would say that the first 2 years of the GNU tend to refute that. So we have to look a little bit at what explains this. I think that there's two main ways of understanding the factors that have made the GNU more stable than what we expected at the time. Number one is that although the political pressure from the Trump administration has been quite intense on South Africa, we have to realize that Africa and South Africa have not been the top priorities of U.S. imperialism. So there's been sort of like, yes, periods, but it's then a bit of a breather in that. But even more decisive and fundamental, I think, is that the global economy and the asset bubble centered on the U.S. have held up for much, longer than we and I think a lot of other people expected. I'm not going to kind of go into that. But I think we need to understand that that does create the room for tempering somewhat the fracturing of the Black elites. And it has been possible for the most part, to keep the decisive section of the Black elites on side and in support of the GNU. One thing I think is worth maybe just kind of, I don't want to get into lots of numbers, but dwelling on for a little bit is the question of debt to the imperialists and the cost of servicing the debt. So South Africa's debt is high and is rising, and currently it's about 22% of state revenue just to keep on rolling over the debt. That's over R1 billion per day, per day if you divide it by a year. But I think we need to keep in mind, like if you compare that, for example, to Nigeria, there the cost is close to 70% of state revenue. So that's quite a qualitative difference. And it's a difference between, what Ramaphosa has been able to do is continue to do some kind of balancing act, while, of course, the trend is towards, capitulation and appeasement of Trump. Whereas in Nigeria, the Tinubu government is just completely under the American boot. And this has an impact as to how much they are able to, continue with bourgeois democratic, foundations and to kind of hold in a bit the collapse and the discontent. I don't in any ways want to say this to prettify the state of the South African economy. It's very bad. Deindustrialization, the jobs bloodbath, and so on keep on going. But I think we just have to realize this, because the other direction, the converse, is that this bubble is going to burst, right? When the US bubble bursts, it's going to mean South African stock exchange and lots of the South African bourgeoisie has their assets overseas. And that is going to mean a sharp destabilization. So the second thing, in terms of the stability of the GNU and what it sort of contrasting to what we wrote there, has to do with what's going to happen when the destabilization comes, which we know comes down to the leadership of the working class. And on this score, the political dynamics since 2024 have actually gotten worse, right? That, the stability of the GNU continues in large part to rest on the fact that there is an ebb in class struggle. The jobs bloodbath, privatization, all of this stuff is going through with little to no resistance. A bit longer term, I would say that if you look at the, strikes and the power of the trade unions, the last really major upsurge was more than 10 years ago, with the wildcat strikes in the Platinum Belt after Marikana, the farm workers strike and the others that spread out in 2012 and 2013, and then followed about a year later by the massive AMCU platinum strike in 2014, which was the longest strike in the history of the country. And since then, what you have, like the main development, it's sort of like the trade union movement has separated, and you have the workers who are in the right, not the right wing, not necessarily the right wing workers, but in COSATU, under the control of the right wing of the bureaucracy, of course, becoming more, tied to the ANC and swallowing all the betrayals. But the left wing, those who are, the workers who are in the section run by the left wing of the bureaucracy, NUMSA and SAFTU, having done a break, but having no answer to radical nationalism, and so basically becoming more and more just isolated from the rest of the working class without any real road to actually carrying out a militant struggle for that. Based on the break with the ANC. So this leaves the left wing, the sections in the working class who are more left-leaning, with no answer other than the EFF as to what to do about the betrayals of the ANC. And of course, the right wing with more ANC betrayals. And this has contributed over a longer term process to worsening disorientation and demoralization among both sections in different ways. We know the EFF is pulled apart by its contradiction between radical demands and rhetoric on the one hand, and it's been increasingly since 2024, and on the other hand, its practice, which has been to double down on electoralism and parliamentarism. And since 2024, what that has meant in terms of its practice is it's been adapting more and more to the shifting right-wing climate. Examples that comrades are familiar with is this stupid and criminal, spiteful sort of knee-jerk reaction to the 2024 elections of saying, you didn't vote for us, we're not going to do anything about your struggles. And I think we should also not downplay at all, but actually try to explain, and in particular to EFF members, how damaging it's been that the EFF since 2024 has refused to mount any serious sustained struggle to defend its own members and even its own organization, and make that struggle a rallying point for those who want to fight back against the GNU. The Kholani Koza case is the most clear example, but I would say even Malema's own defense, obviously they defend Malema, but besides one big rally that they held in January, the second one was demobilized, and all of the hopes and the court has been set on the courts. Obviously, there's also a huge responsibility, all wings of the trade union bureaucracy who have resisted any kind of, although it's popular among their members, doing anything about this, and much of the far left, which has dismissed it with their usual sectarian attitude towards the EFF and other radical nationalists. The reason I want to kind of go into that a bit at length is that, number one, I think it's important because this is the context of growing layers of the working class who are sick of the ANC, as pretty much everybody is, turning to right-wing nationalists like the MK, and also turning to the reactionary forces that MK is in a line with, like March and March. The reality is that because no amount of saying, yes, people have legitimate anger about the conditions, but they need to direct it at the right source, is going to actually stop that unless there actually is a struggle against the ruling class and the imperialists. The second thing that I think we really we can't remind ourselves enough that we actually have been the ones who have been clearly and consistently fighting for this. Again, our forces are very small, so we don't want to act like we're, hot shit or something that we're not. But for the past 2 years, I think to people who have been looking, whether in the EFF or in the other left groups, in the unions and, SACP members even, it is very clear that the Spartacists have been pushing for this kind of campaign. And especially kind of in the situation that we are, say, after June 30th and in the lead up to June 30th, where the results of that are very clear to everybody. They are quite horrible. And it's a pretty bad situation. One good thing is that I don't think anybody on the left can be in denial about how bad the situation is. But it is important to keep in mind and be able to put forward when we're, talking to the people on the left about what needs to be done now in this horrible situation, that there is a different way. And the different way also involves turning things around. You have to deal with the fact that this situation that we're in hasn't just happened overnight. It's been accumulation of a long trend of the different sections of the left, the trade union bureaucracy, the radical nationalists, and so on. Okay, so just to make the point clear, which I think we all realize, is that what is the main beneficiaries of the ANC's collapse are the right-wing parties. Now, obviously, we got to see it will be a thing to see in the actual elections. How exactly does that play out? If I were to speculate at this point, I would say I expect parties like MK to do quite well. Action SA, Patriotic Alliance, maybe, although they've been pretty in the GNU, so they're having problems. Whereas it would be a surprise to me if the EFF gained from previous elections. In fact, I think they will either stagnate or decline. What I want to address most is the MK. The reason is because I think, one, we ourselves, and a lot of people too, have been caught off guard a couple of times that I can think of by the MK. First, I think everybody was caught off guard by their performance in the elections in 2024. But also, Arthur pointed out, we were not really prepared for, at the conference of the left, how big and domineering a role they were going to play. And I think that generally there's confusion and no idea about how to deal with the MK on the left. So to start with what is kind of clear, I think, to all of us, the main social force that MK Party represents and rests on is the disgruntled Black elites who have been shoved aside, and many of them have been prosecuted and some sent to jail since the Ramaphosa clique took over control of the ANC. Zuma, as we know from going back to, before 2007, he is really a master. One of his political talents is cohering and holding together these disparate groups of what were called the coalition of the wounded, right? When Mbeki was at the head of the ANC, basically everybody who had a beef with Mbeki, from Kosatu and Vavi to the SACP to Malema and the business, different business interests, they were all rallied together, right? Using populism and other kinds of things. What we know is after 2007, when Zuma came into the head of the ANC and then in government, there wasn't anything like a pink tide in South Africa, pink tide in Latin America, like with Lula and these sort of left-leaning populist governors. Instead, what happened was Maracana. And I think that although, we have to realize is one part of what Zuma and the MK do is they do seek support of the Black masses. They give mainly demagogic and reactionary answers to the legitimate grievances and aspirations, but they also do make an effort to try to provide the slightest bit of left-wing gloss to attract radical intellectuals and others and appeal to an anti-imperialist sentiment. And I think that's important because otherwise you can't make any sense of why they even bothered to do this whole conference of the left thing. And so we have kind of the MK is on the one hand very shambolic and faction-ridden itself. You have Zuma's own daughter being kicked out by these other guys just a few weeks ago. They're utterly incapable of even holding a conference to constitute themselves as a party with a constitution, let alone mobilize a coherent force that can confront the interests of the white ruling class and the imperialists. But at the same time, they have been able to they are currently still, I think, and I believe the local elections are going to show this, although a lot of people have, written them off after the 2024 elections, a pretty major political role. And the reason for this mainly is because of the paralysis and weakness of the left and the leaders of the working class, who generally don't have any good response or way to take on the MK. More specifically, you see on the left a polarization between two different kinds of responses to the MK. One is those who are paralyzed and kind of politically held hostage by the MK because they fear to break unity. They want to keep unity with the MK. And the second are those who simply denounce them as reactionary, tribalists, and some of them even fascists. So in the first category, I would say you have the SACP very clearly, people like Irvin Jim, the EFF, and even the SOPA, Black Consciousness types, although they tend to kind of go back and forth depending on where the strongest pressure comes from. In the second category, you have Vavi and the sort of progressive trade union bureaucrats from SAFTU. Abahlali, Basam Jondolo is one sort of significant weighty force, and the Trotskyists, basically. So it's kind of the same lines. These are the lines along which the question of participation in the Conference of the Left or not was polarized. And they also roughly correspond to how people respond to the question of national liberation, too. I think what we really need to be quite insistent on and argue and develop is that both of these are bankrupt. Then what's really necessary to do, and what neither one of these two different poles does, is to politically confront and smash MK's influence. So I guess what I want to conclude with is a little bit about some ideas about how to do this going forward, especially to make the point that in the first instance, what this means is exposing and combating the programs that lock in the two different groups to one or the other pole, mainly about the EFF. So I think what sort of our intervention in the Conference of the Left itself and with the open letter and the work we've done since then shows is that the EFF has quite a big contradiction over this question, because they are really one of the major targets of March and March. There's a huge amount of hatred among especially left-wing members of the EFF towards the MK for a variety of reasons, including the fact that, MK panders to and promotes chauvinism and tribalism, which the EFF members, as sort of coming from the Pan-Africanist trend, recognize as reactionary. Also, many people recognize the MK is trying to destroy the EFF, and so it's their own organization. But the policy of the leadership is very clearly to preserve the rotten bloc with MK. Number one, because this is a parliamentary route to undermining, they see this as the best parliamentary route to undermining Ramaphosa's position, right? With the Pala thing, with all these other things to put pressure on the ANC to ditch Ramaphosa and to hope that this is a way to get a left, quote unquote, left GNU with the MK and the ANC. What comes on top of that, especially with the EFF's paralysis on March and March, is that the practical sort of means by which they're pursuing this hope of a GNU with ANC and MK are these coalition governments in Joburg and in the province, right? And so that, again, is a barrier to actually mobilizing the membership to fight and take on March and March and the others who are, waging these pogromist campaigns. Again, we should be clear, that's going to be a hard task, but unless you start with the political break that's needed with MK and actually, fighting that and fighting the parliamentarist program that keeps the EFF locked into that, you're not going to be able to make any kind of headway on it. The other poll, I think we probably could maybe dig into this a little bit more when we talk about the June 30th more specifically, but it's very clear the left's, the far left's response, which is basically, boycott the Conference of the Left, walk out, these kinds of things, dismiss, all that really does is actually make it easier for the EFF leaders and the SACP leaders and the other leaders of the trade unions and other left organizations that were at this to suppress this contradiction, to hold it in check. Whereas what we really need to be doing is hammering on this contradiction. And I think that this is both, obviously we have a big fight to wage an uphill battle with the Trotskyist groups because their dismissal on this really is also deeply intertwined with their really liberal response on immigration. So for them, it's like, how could you ever, wage a political fight with the MK, with groups like the EFF that are in this block with the MK. But I also think that SOPA SOPA is also a place where we need to concentrate this. And they are very aggressive about, we want to be part of the conference of the left, right? And saying decent things like we should polarize it, we should, sharpen the contradiction then. But their actual approach to doing this totally, I think, conciliates the SACP and the EFF leadership. In other words, like they're in the end, they're happy to have general declarations about class struggle, about anti-imperialism and stuff like that, and not actually raise the issues that are going to draw a sharp line practically over what to do there. And they're still a part of this, the council of the left, the leadership body, the steering committee, that even though they said the steering committee should meet and the steering committee ignored them over the anti-immigrant marches and MK's role in them. So I think that actually trying to, argue and struggle with the SOPA guys about how and put forward a way how to actually have a left caucus that is pushing to sharpen this is an important thing for us to do. Going a little bit further down the line, the one of the things I think that is important for us to intervening in the left about the local elections. One is the question, the role played by the EFF's participation in the Joburg and these other coalition governments is so clear and is really reactionary in terms of polarizing any kind of, mobilization in response to both the attacks on them and the anti-immigrant attacks and all these other things that are going on, that you can't avoid that when approaching these local elections. In other words, I don't think we can take the same approach. In 2024, it was clearly the case that the EFF's program drew a line against imperialism. When you're talking, though, about these local elections, especially given how central Joburg is, I don't think that that's the case, because them being in these coalitions is such a clear, really holding back any kind of struggle concretely against imperialism on this line. The actual practice has been very passive, not doing anything outside of parliament really, and the occasional sort of celebratory rally. And so I think that there could be quite a bit of, further turmoil if in the wake of this election. So I think that's part of the reason why we should look for ways to try to keep on explaining these points in relation to the anti-immigrant rallies and in the local elections. We don't just want to be kind of standing aside, so that, like we said in our first thing about the elections, don't just sit back while this party is pulled apart by its contradictions. That would be a bad outcome. Okay, so South Africa in 5 years. I do think it's hard to say. The reason why I talked about the whole stuff with the police and these inquiries is, I do think Bonapartism seems like a very real possibility. The thing is, though, that it's quite tricky because the white ruling class is wedded to the USA, right? I mean, that's kind of and the military is definitely not. You had that guy, forget the one commander who went to Iran during or shortly after the 12-day war. They're very this is a big issue. Although you do sort of start, we've been talking about it, the Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi definitely seems like he's a guy from, ANC background, but his real politics are more to the right, like IFP. He's anti-union, anti-immigrant. That seems like there probably are, there definitely are elements that, and he's very popular because of his stance against the corruption and exposing all this stuff and getting tough on crime. So there definitely is a room for that. But I think it's hard to say. I mean, another party that would clearly work, you could see in a Bonapartist role is MK. But there again, it's kind of the problem because, I didn't really speak too much about China in terms of China's influence on South Africa. But I do think that, as much as not for the US, the top priority, the Chinese bureaucracy is definitely looking. Like actually at the Conference of the Left, there were those two guys in very expensive suits Chinese guys who came up in a BMW and were just watching everything. Like there's no question that the CPC definitely had an eye on this Conference of the Left. They didn't intervene or anything like that. And they're Vijay Prashad and that whole tricontinental definitely is tied. But I mean, it's like, again, this Conference of the Left, the impression that it made is not that it's like the new Popular Front that's going to ride to power, because it doesn't seem like, it doesn't even seem like it's going to hold together and do anything. But, and I think like, look, MK definitely, like they spoke at the Conference of the Left. They were very like pro-China, China's development model, all this, great stuff. But at a certain level, like they can talk about that stuff, but I think also they're also looking for money wherever they can get it from too. So I think we can't like overestimate, it is true that like generally, Zuma tried to kind of like, push against US influence and look for other means of support, but it only went to a certain extent, really. Normally, this would be the time for the DA to really like press its hand. And to some extent, they are kind of doing that. They have, like Lawrence, you were talking about, they have their own, problems in scandals internally. But I think the main thing why we don't see like a big thing with them, like making demands and sort of like pushing for speeding up, conciliation with the US and other things that we know they want, is that they are being held back by the landlords who say, now is not the time to like make political hay out of Ramaphosa and the ANC's difficulty, because they sort of have this feeling like if he's not there, that might be a win for us in one election, but where is it going to leave the whole thing? Only going to make the ANC that much quicker into a party that you can't really, rely on even for a coalition.
All right, so there you have it, a glimpse of South African politics. I am sure this will be coming your way in some kind of written form soon. I will also be trying to organize another discussion on the 30th June anti-immigrant protests in the country, which really are a sign of where things are headed. You can follow our comrades in South Africa at @AmaBolsheviki on X. I will link that in the show notes. Until next time, goodbye.
Well, I ain't got no smoke, at least not with you. And I don't know if you don't know, but there are just a few of oligarchs and capitalists profiting massive profits, holding us down